Hey, what's up? It's Jared with Ditch Auto, and these are the top 5 camera settings that I change on the DJI Mavic Air for shooting photos. Now, I also have a video on shooting video, the top 5 settings that I changed, so make sure to check that out. And one other video that I think is extremely important that I'm going to talk about at the beginning here. So the first thing that I think is most important with a DJI Mavic Air is shooting in manual mode. So if you don't understand shooting in manual mode with your camera, I highly recommend checking out that video. I've got it linked down below and in the card above so that you can see that video. I think it's extremely important because though the camera is actually pretty good, it isn't going to give you the quality of image that you're expecting or that you're hoping for unless you're shooting in manual mode. If you're wondering why your images are a little flat in comparison to others, or they don't have that cool kind of like cinematic drone look, it's probably because you're shooting in automatic mode. So you'll definitely want to check that out. So the first thing that I automatically do, and you can see I've already got it changed, is I go and shoot in JPEG and RAW format. Now out of the box, this thing's going to shoot in JPEG. There's really nothing wrong with JPEG, but the problem with a JPEG image is that it's compressed from the get-go. So you're losing image quality right out of the camera. Though it will produce a decent image, and one could say not everybody really needs to shoot in RAW, but for me, I like having the ability to go and edit that photo on my computer or on a smartphone app, and I found that you have much more flexibility in doing that when you shoot in RAW because the raw image is raw out of the camera, no compression, nothing changed. You have a lot more flexibility there, and so I like having that, so I shoot in JPEG plus RAW. I shoot in JPEG plus RAW as opposed to RAW only because I like to have that JPEG image in case I just want to quickly share it through social media or something like that. Though a lot more devices are accepting RAW images and able to edit RAW images, it's easier to transfer JPEG images. They're smaller size, they're not huge images. This will export a DNG style RAW image, and not all cameras can handle the DNG style. So I do the JPEG plus RAW just so that I have that flexibility. But shooting in RAW gives you that extra information in your image so that you can go and color correct it. You could do a lot more to it later on in software on your computer or on a smart device. So as I mentioned before, the second thing I do is go and shoot in manual mode. You can see there's automatic mode, which is going to change and adjust all the settings as I do on the fly. So for somebody who's maybe a beginner, shooting in automatic mode might be best to kind of get your feet wet. So I shoot in manual mode because I want my image to be more consistent. As you fly around, there may be little differences that your camera decides to compensate for by changing the exposure of your image. And that means that some of your images may be super bright and some of them might be a little bit darker, even though the overall scene that you were flying in was relatively the same. So for me, I like to be able to control that manually, which means playing with the settings a lot more while I'm flying, but nonetheless, my images end up looking much more consistent. Now, DJI has gotten really good at automatic mode. The automatic mode's gotten much better than it used to be. But if you're wanting an image that, and this is where manual mode really comes into play, if you're wanting an image that has more of a balanced sharpness as far as everything that's in the image, meaning that your target point of interest is more sharp, but everything else is maybe a little bit more soft or a little bit blurry, because it is a drone that's flying, so you want to make it look like it's something that's moving. So the image has to have some movement there. You're going to want to shoot in manual mode, and you'll want to check out the video that I put out on how to shoot manual mode with your drone, because that's going to show you the settings. I'm going to talk about what these different settings do, how to use manual mode. But for me, manual mode all the time, it's just a must. It's where I shoot, and it's going to get you better images. So the second thing I do is go and set a custom white balance. You can see here I've got it set to sunny. If you shoot an auto white balance and fly around, some of your images are going to be warmer, some of them are going to be cooler because maybe you're flying towards the sun, not completely towards it, away from it. You want all of your images to have kind of a generalized color. Now, because you're shooting in RAW, if you're shooting in RAW like I am, you can color correct all of your images later, but it's still better just because of the small sensor on this camera that you do your best to get it right in camera, which means setting the white balance to something that makes sense for where you're at. So there is auto, sunny, cloudy, and then there's 2 for different lighting types, which means flying indoors, which I don't know about that, and then custom. So you can go and set a custom white balance, which over to the right is warmer, over to the left is cooler. So you could set a custom white balance if you feel comfortable with that. But for me, I typically choose sunny if there's no clouds, and I'll choose cloudy if there's some or a lot of clouds. And then I'll just go with one of those two, because it means it's setting it at a predetermined amount, color temperature, and as I fly around, it's not changing. Cloudy is one color temperature, sunny is one single color temperature, and I'll get that consistency there. The next thing I do is change my photo style, or I guess the image style. There's standard, landscape, and soft. Now, all of those are kind of things that you can change based on what you're actually taking pictures of. For me, I want a little bit flatter of an image because I want my contrast and my sharpening and my vibrance to be added in post-production. I'm never too often taking a photo with the drone and uploading it or sharing it or delivering it or wherever it's going straight out of camera. That's almost never. So I want a little bit flatter of an image so that I can add some more stuff in. If I want an image to be super contrasty, meaning the darks are really dark and the brights are really bright and there's not much room in between, I want to be the one that did that. I want to have the information there so that I can do that. So the standard color is all flat zeros all the way across. I go with a -3 on the sharpening, a -1 on the contrast, and a -3 on the saturation, simply because I want more control later on in the image. I don't want all of that stuff to be pre-applied. Now, shooting in RAW still, like I said before, gives me more flexibility, but I want the camera to do a lot less, and even especially to that JPEG, because I am shooting out a JPEG as well, so I want that JPEG to have a little less formatting on it. So whether or not this really affects the RAW image or not, the JPEG image would be affected a lot, and I want less to be done to that JPEG image. So I would recommend setting your custom image style here a little bit, and then you can even go into the color profile. This is really only for video. You have your color profile normal, but if you're in video, there's decine-alike, which is good. So in video, it's more important to have this stuff changed because we're not shooting raw video here. Video is highly compressed, especially out of a drone like this, so there's a lot less room to play with. So with this drone, normal color profile, the image style, we go a little bit subdued so that I have room to play later on when I'm editing the photo. So one of the last things that I do is I go, and I already have it enabled, you can see it here, but I'll go ahead and remove it. So we go into the gear tab and I turn on histogram and I turn on the grid lines. Now the histogram allows me to see in areas of the photo that might be hard to see when I'm flying and looking at a small display. It's really hard to tell your exposure when you're flying around, like what areas are super dark and what areas are overexposed. It's hard to pay attention to that. So the histogram gives you a more visual representation on how to see what's going on around you. And of course you can see, because we're in a darker room, and especially if I cover up the camera, the histogram's pushed all the way up against the left, which is the darks. And if we point the camera more at something that is bright, you can see we get the histogram moving over to the right-hand side. And so that gives me a better idea of what I'm looking at. And then I can adjust my exposure, which I talk about in the manual mode video a little bit more, going in and adjusting my camera settings a little bit. The histogram kind of gives me some help there. So definitely go and check out that video so that you can learn a little bit more about what the histogram does and how to shoot in manual like I talked about earlier. The grid lines make it really nice because with the grid lines I'm able to actually see kind of and align things more in like a rule of thirds. So with the grid lines, if I'm trying to position someone centered, it makes it much easier for me. If I'm trying to use a little bit of positive or negative space and position my subject or my object somewhere else in the scene, it makes it much easier for me to line that up, especially if I'm trying to be consistent by taking multiple images. I can use these lines to more easily compose my shot than if not having them at all. I think that that's extremely important, and so I always have those turned on. So there's one very important tool that you have for maintaining exposure or even knowing where to go with your exposure as you're flying. The camera has a meter here which kind of gives you an idea of where your exposure is. As you can see, we're at -2.3, which means we're a bit underexposed. If I increase my shutter speed a bit, you can see we're getting closer to 0, and now we're at positive 0.3. And so our exposure is more along the lines of where it should be. When you're flying around and you're trying to find your exposure, you're going to want to rely heavily on the histogram and on the meter here to kind of determine where your exposure should be. So having that histogram up so you know the areas that are blown out, because the exposure is kind of a general meter of everything that the camera sees. So you could have it nice right here at 0.3, but there could be one area that's actually blown out, and you'd be able to tell because maybe the histogram is maxed out over onto the side. So the combination of these two tools make it really easy for you to determine what is exposed properly and what is not. Getting a good practice, I think, for me, is I typically, with the camera settings that I use, fly around at like a plus 0.3 to maybe 0.7. Somewhere right in there is good because this camera isn't really have that huge of a dynamic range. So my practice is to kind of overexpose a little bit and then color correct a little bit to bring in a little bit of contrast. Now this definitely is different whether I'm shooting photo or video. If I'm shooting video, I definitely overexpose a little bit more than I would if I'm shooting photo, because in that raw photo that we can get out of the camera, I have more room to work than when I'm editing the video. So I tend to overexpose just a little bit, or what seems like overexposing, but when I go and actually match that up to other footage, it looks pretty good. And in photos, I can go more of an even exposure, maybe, you know, like a 0.0 straight across, because I have more room to play with that raw photo than I do with the video. So those are my 5 settings that I change. I have one pro tip, which is always format your card inside of the drone. Don't format it in your computer. Put the card in your drone, go into your settings, click on the gear icon, scroll to the bottom, and format your SD card there. Of course, you can also format your internal storage because the drone does have some of its own internal storage, but I highly recommend always formatting your SD card inside the drone as opposed to a computer or something like that. It's just a better practice, and I've never had a card fail on me when I do it this way. When I've done it the other way, format it on a computer, or maybe I took a SD card that was in a GoPro and then put it into a DJI, I always end up having problems there. So make sure to format your cards inside of whatever device you're going to be using them in. So with that, I hope that you enjoyed this video. Give it a thumbs up if you liked it, and subscribe to our channel if you want to see more videos from us. There are other videos about the Mavic Air, and I've linked to those in the description below, so make sure to check that out. I appreciate you checking out our video. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope that we get to see you back here soon on Ditch Auto. Take care.